Welcome to Begin Your Journey channel. He served as both a military strategist and a political advisor to President Donald Trump. It's a pleasure to see you once again. Well, I'm delighted to see you, though. I must admit, I don't profess to. I agree with the idea of being an intellectual. Nonetheless, making intellectualism a full-time commitment is beyond my reach. However, I would like to discuss the initial phase of this counteroffensive. We heavily armed Ukraine to confront Russia, placing our hopes on this political offensive as the sole path to ultimate victory. Probably the results haven't been as promo as we envisioned, and so I'm curious about the current situation on the ground, the developments that have occurred, and where this is leading. Are we witnessing its conclusion? I believe it's safe to say that ground operations for the Ukrainian military have, for the most part, come to an end. Their casualties have been devastating, have come across estimates suggesting over 430,000 Ukrainian soldiers have lost their lives. Some sources even indicate higher numbers, but such information isn't prevalent in the Western media due to censorship. Tip: I've always stuck with the figure of 400,000 casualties, but there are suggestions that it might be an underestimate. It's challenging to ascertain the number of hundreds of thousands wounded. There was a report, perhaps by President Putin, suggesting 71,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. That might be an accurate figure. To be candid, the Russians have been more forthright about both their own and Ukrainian casualties than we have. It's not a comfortable truth for Americans. But our government hasn't been particularly transparent regarding this entire situation as far as the Ukrainian ground war is concerned. It appears to be at a standstill, if not effectively concluded. They are grappling with a severe shortage of manpower and are attempting to conscript individuals within their borders who might not be genuinely fit for combat wherever they are, driving to repatriate Ukrainian men of military age from abroad. But I don't see that materializing. I doubt most European governments are willing to mobilize their resources to apprehend and forcibly deport young Ukrainian men. Perhaps I'm mistaken, but I remain skeptical about the feasibility of such an endeavor. I believe we've entered a distinct phase in the ongoing conflict. Today, a friend reached out to me with an interesting perspective, stating I believe we're now transitioning into what I call Biden's phase of the war. Naturally, I inquired, what do you mean by that? He elaborated with Ukrainian ground forces reaching their limits and confronting the enemy. Their only recourse now seems to be acquiring long-range strike, such as the Storm Shadow or Taurus missile, to target the Russians. Upon reflection, it became evident that recent events seemed to align with this notion. Notably, there was a substantial strike directed towards Crimea, involving the launch of 11 Storm Shadow missiles from 624 aircraft. These missiles were dispatched and then swiftly treated to avoid enemy fire, while Russian integrated our defenses managed to intercept 8 of the 11 missiles. The remaining 3 found their mark, inflicting significant damage on ships located in Dry Docker Harbor in Sevastopol. Furthermore, underwater, where drones often referred to as underwater unmanned systems were deployed. It's important to note that the term drone is now commonly used in this context. These underwater systems seem to share British origins, much like the Storm Shadow missiles. What's particularly disconcerting is that both American and British and potentially French intelligence surveillance reconnaissance the platforms, whether unmanned. The man played a crucial role in guiding these strikes, both for the underwater drones and Storm Shadow missiles. This assistance even involved the deployment of a global hawk despite a prior incident where the Russians had downed one over the Black Sea. It's a matter of concern, as it essentially implies that we have become caught belligerents. The pressing question: how long will the Russians exercise restraint before targeting the sources of these weapons and capabilities, which could include Great Britain, the United States, France, and possibly Germany? Regrettably, I lack definitive answer to this question. To summarize, we find ourselves in a new phase of the conflict. This phase is characterized by the heightened reliance on long-range strikes, primarily due to the exhaustion of alternative strategies by the Ukrainians. Engaging in such strikes is inherently perilous. It seems that the Russians are slowly realizing that a military resolution might be the only way to bring an end to this conflict. Consequently, I'm vigilantly observing for signs of preparations for significant offensive operation. It's important to note that some of the strikes targeting the Russians in the Black Sea region were launched from coastal positions. Situated between Odyssey and the Romanian border lies a crucial region, posing a pressing question of how far the Russian forces are willing to extend their reach, contemplating when they might decide to cross the Near River and assert dominance over Odessa and the southern coastline raises concern. It is undeniable within Russia's security interest to do so. Yet the uncertainty shrouding the inner workings of Moscow and the general staff, as well as the instructions issued by President Putin to his field forces, leave us in a state of anticipation to discern the unfolding events. Indeed, the situation has us all waiting with bated breath as we ponder what course of action the Russians will ultimately pursue. The utilization of NATO missiles and the assaults on Crimea has raised eyebrows, revealing that it is NATO intelligence that selects the targets and NATO-trained soldiers who execute the orders. Despite these facts, there seems to be a collective denial that we are active participants in this conflict. However, if the scenario were reversed, with the Russians conducting similar actions on the American border, orchestrating deep strikes and supplying weaponry within the United States, our side would unquestionably reject the notion that the Russians are not participants. Thus, it is increasingly apparent that from my perspective, we find ourselves enmeshed in this war with Russia, our nation that happens to be the world's foremost nuclear power. Nevertheless, the lingering question is how far can this conflict escalate before NATO retaliates? Conversely, we must also consider the prospect of Russia striking back at NATO. A prevailing constraint on Russia's part is the aversion to risking a nuclear or even a conventional war. With NATO, nevertheless, as the West heightens the stakes by introducing more potent weaponry, the specter of inaction looms. Larger, there is a growing chorus of voices in Moscow, contending that Putin has been too lenient by refraining from retaliation. The argument emanating from Moscow is that their restraint emboldens the West to assume that the Russians lack their resolve to respond forcefully. This sentiment prompts the crucial question of Russia's potential retaliatory actions and the possible targets they might select. Would their actions be aimed at the Poles, the British, or another entity? The question is left open for consideration due to the inherent risks associated with direct assaults on Ukrainian forces and the prospect of mounting an all-out offensive to end this war outweigh the potential risks of an action. At present, it is evident that the Russian populace is exceedingly sensitive to the attacks perpetrated against Russians on Russian soil. These developments have ignited a sense of urgency and concern, underscoring the gravity of the situation. It is important to remember that every government is tasked with the profound responsibility of safeguarding the security and well-being of its citizens in the region. Nestled between Odessa and the Romanian border, a significant geopolitical concern arises. How close are Russian forces willing to approach the proximity to the Near River and the potential for Russian control of and the southern coastline provoke speculation? While such a move alliance with Russia's security interests the enigmatic decision-making processes in Moscow and the instructions given by and Putin to the field forces leave us in a state of anticipation, uncertain of the next unfolding chapter. In this narrative, the recent utilization of NATO missiles in the Crimea attacks raises intriguing questions. It becomes apparent that NATO intelligence selects the targets and NATO-trained soldiers execute the operations. Despite these circumstances, there seems to be a collective cognitive dissonance regarding our role as active participants in this conflict. In a hypothetical scenario where the roles were reversed, with Russians launching similar operations near the American border, directing deep strikes and supplying weapons within the United States, it is clear that the prevailing narrative would vehemently reject the notion that Russia is not an active participant. Thus, it becomes increasingly evident that from my perspective, we are embroidered in this conflict with Russia, a nation that happens to possess the world's most formidable nuclear. Personal. Nevertheless, the looming question remains: how far can this conflict escalate before NATO response? Conversely, We must also contemplate the possibility of Russia retaliating against NATO. Russia's reluctance to risk a nuclear or conventional war with NATO